I believe that with the mathematical collapse of the dollar, the criminal elite are already planning to use their Hegelian dialectic of the gold standard as the antithesis of their thesis of unbacked fiat currencies. I believe that the synthesis solution will be a fraudulently backed gold digital currency that will almost instantly be rehypothecated and counterfeited to benefit those who already own the system. I believe it's vitally important that people start getting their minds around how societies are pushed through this Hegelian dialectic for their predetermined solution. This is why humanity keeps revolving around in the debt and death paradigm and never truly evolving past this system. In this series of videos, I'm going to explain about a lot of the people who are gold standard proponents and how they will be used to justify a fraudulent gold-backed digital currency. One of the lower men on the totem pole was actually somebody that testified with Rob Gray when we went down at Ron Paul's congressional hearing on competitive currencies. His name was Nathan Lewis, and he's the author of Gold, Once and Future Money. In a previous video, I spoke about how he laid out the framework to put into action a 10-minute gold standard that would keep the Federal Reserve in power. Instead of printing money based off of interest rates, they would do it against the gold price. Another article that he wrote was called The 1870 to 1914 Gold Standard, the Most Perfect One Ever Created. And in the Sons of Liberty Academy, I covered this time period, and I can tell you what, it's not so wonderful. Those that cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I'd like to give a quick history lesson that many of you might find boring, but I feel it's one of the most important lessons that I've ever run across. And I feel that once you understand this history lesson, you'll see why I feel the new Hegelian dialectic of a gold-based digital currency is something that we need to be aware of and fight. After I covered how the bankers divided the nation and funded both sides of the Civil War for power and profit. When the Civil War first started, a man named Joseph Seligman was known as the Rothschild of America, and I will cover him later. He was responsible for floating almost all the bonds of the North, while the Lehman Brothers floated almost all the bonds in the South. When the bankers started asking for 20 and 30% interest rates on bonds, Lincoln was forced to create greenbacks. And greenbacks were debt-free currency notes that were printed up by the Treasury. They had nothing to do with a privately owned banking system and did not issue any debt against it. From 1862 to 1863, he printed millions in legal tender called greenbacks. These notes were used as money and had no interest against it. The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of the consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of the government, but it's the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be able to save an immense amount of sums of interest. The money will cease to be master and become the servant of humanity. Abraham Lincoln. After Lincoln said that, the Times of New London in 1862 wrote this: "If the mischievous financial policy which has its origin in North America shall be endurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off the debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." Abraham Lincoln finally caved into the bankers in 1863, during a decisive part of the Civil War where he needed more money that Congress was reluctant to approve. He signed the National Bank Act that gave the powers of the bonds to earn tax-free money from monetization of government bonds. Right after that was passed, Secretary of Treasury Salmon Chase said, "My agency in promoting the passage of the National Banking Act was my greatest financial mistake in my life. It has built up a monopoly which affects every interest in the country." Lincoln did get some unexpected help prior to his assassination from the Tsar of Russia. Tsar Alexander II was fighting the same battle against the bankers in his kingdom. He refused to allow the bankers to control the money supply through establishing a central bank. Tsar Alexander II came to Lincoln's aid after he saw what the bankers were doing to the United States. The Tsar warned the Rothschild-controlled countries of Britain and France, who had armies in Canada and Mexico, waiting for the outcome of the war, that if they should intervene in the Civil War, that he would consider an act of war against Russia. There was an attempted assassination attempt against the Tsar in 1866, and he was finally killed in 1880. At the height of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was quoted as saying, "The money powers prey upon a nation in times of peace and conspire against it in times of adversity. The banking powers are more despotic than any monarchy, more insolent than any autocracy, more selfish than any bureaucracy. They denounce as public enemies all who question their methods or throw light upon their crimes. I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one in my rear is my greatest foe." Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated soon after speaking those words around the time that he was reelected and Lee surrendered to Grant. The death of Lincoln was a disaster for Christendom. There was no man in the United States great enough to wear his boots, and the bankers went anew to grab the riches. I fear that foreign bankers and their craftiness or tortuous tricks will entirely control the exuberant riches of America and will be used to systematically corrupt civilization. They will not hesitate to plunge the whole of Christendom into war and chaos in order that the earth shall become their inheritance. Otto von Bismarck. So flash forward right after the Civil War. April 12, 1866, Congress passed the Contraction Act, removing greenbacks from circulation. So all that debt-free money that Lincoln put into circulation as a blessing to society. So the bankers went about removing this debt-free money from circulation. After the Civil War, the bankers removed almost 70% of the money in circulation by calling in loans that were owed and not making any new loans. This was done because the bankers profited off of deflation. By contracting the money supply, the value of the loan payments had higher and higher purchasing power, allowing the bankers to buy more and more assets with a steady stream of income from the loans. Also, this deflationary process impoverished the American people by weakening whatever opposition that the bankers still had. Now that the bankers had control of the currency and the gold, they set their sight on the people's money, silver. They have had a very good success of controlling the issuance of credit through politics. They had a monopoly on gold, since only the rich had enough expendable cash to buy and hoard gold. Silver was historically 15 times more plentiful than gold and therefore harder for the bankers to monopolize. So then they pushed for the notion of a gold standard. Once the country was on the gold standard, the money power could begin to foment the crisis necessary for the reintroduction of a privately held central bank, which wouldn't come until 1913 with the Federal Reserve. It is no coincidence that 8 years after Lincoln was taken out of the picture, that silver was demonetized in the crime of 1873. The demonetization of silver was nothing more than removing silver as a lawful form of payment for loans and taxes. The bankers knew that they had to do this in advance of the Comstock load, or the economy would be flooded with silver to pay off the debts, so they demonetized it. Ernest Sade was given by the Rothschild control the Bank of England £100,000 of British money to bribe the necessary officials for the demonetization of silver. The Mint Act of 1873 later became known as the Crime of 1873, eliminating silver as a lawful currency, though they still made silver trade dollars for China. All the major powers, the United States, England, France, and Germany, were all under the gold standard. Silver was treated as trash as the monetary demand was eliminated and silver lost much of its value. People were forced to dump their silver to buy gold that was even harder to get, which, by the way, was only bought and sold to Europe by the bankers. All of this played into the bankers' hands, who not only had debts owed to them, but also had a lock on the only form of legal tender acceptable to pay those debts. Farmers in particular were destroyed by the crime of 1873. And on top of this crime, there was also great scandals whereby the United States government gave away 200 million acres of land to railway corporations after these farmers had been destroyed. So this most perfect time period of a gold standard that Nathan Lewis is talking about, in post-war Civil War depression, in 1866 there was approximately $1.8 billion in circulation, or about $50 per person in the United States. A year later, the monetary supply dropped $500 million. The available money per person was only $44 per capita. By 1876, the total amount of money in circulation was $600 million, or only $14 per person in the United States. And by 1886, there was less than $400 million, or $6.67 of currency per capita. By demonetizing silver, it had enhanced the exchange value of gold over any form of property. Since the rich elite already were the ones that owned it, they could create windfalls for themselves. No one can imagine, all the languages of the world cannot express what the people of the United States suffered from 1873 to 1879. Colonel Ingersoll. It is crimes like this, or the fact that the bankers in private can control the value of all the properties, is perhaps one of the greatest crimes ever perpetuated in modern civilization. But it didn't stop there. James Garfield was elected president in 1880. And here's his quote: "By the experience of commercial nations in all ages, it has found that gold and silver afford the only safe foundation of a monetary system. Confusion has recently been created by variations in the relative value of the two metals, but I confidently believe that arrangements can be made between the leading commercial nations which secure the general use of both metals." He goes on to say, "Whoever controls the volume of money in a country is absolute master of all industry and commerce, and that when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or the other by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. And the final quote that I would like to say from President James Garfield: "A brave man is one who dares to look the devil in the face and tell him he's the devil." A few weeks later, after saying those words, he was assassinated. I found a memo from the American Bankers Association of 1891 to all banks to create a depression in 3 years' time. On September 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and 1,000 of them east of the Mississippi as well at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants as in England. This memo was verified in Congress in 1913 when it was quoted in opposition for the proposed Federal Reserve Act. The boom-bust cycle is nothing more than the bankers expanding and contracting the monetary supply, and they do this to gain the real assets and strengthen their control. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of the currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent that their fathers conquered. The last resistance through the bankers' monopoly of the gold standard was a politician named William Jennings Bryan. Bryan represented the free silver movement that wanted to break the bankers' monopoly on gold and credit by allowing free coinage of silver at a fixed ratio of 16-1 to gold. This was a way to break the deflation that plagued the country and brought the power back from Washington and Wall Street. The peak of the free silver movement culminated with William Jennings Bryan, at 36 years old, taking the Democratic nomination for president in 1896. There he gave one of the most famous speeches in American politics, the Cross of Gold speech. What is needed is an Andrew Jackson to stand as Jackson stood against the encroachments of organized wealth. It is the issue of 1776 all over again. Our ancestors, when but 3 million in number, had the courage to declare their political independence on every other nation. Shall we, their descendants, when we have grown to 70 million, declare that we are less independent than our forefathers? Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests and the laboring interests and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying unto them, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon the cross of gold." William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was defeated by Wall Street-backed William McKinley in 1896. And since then, the bankers have gone on to consolidate power through the 1907 panic, leading to the foundation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, and the rest is history. We will have an opportunity to put a stop to this debt and death paradigm, but it is imperative that people get ahead of this curve and stop playing along in their electronic games. The dollar system will collapse, and they will offer another predetermined outcome. I believe that the only solution is the opposite consciousness solution. Not another monopoly currency, not another intangible currency, not even a fully backed gold commodity currency. The solution is competitive currencies that are fully backed by real commodities, land, or energy. In the meantime, the only thing that you can do is to invest in real assets, real skills, and real friends.